I Should Be Writing, Season 21, Episode 6.
Well, I should be writing. I should be working on my craft. I should be writing. I should be submitting my next draft. But I'm sitting home watching Doctor Who.
Hi there. Welcome to I Should Be Writing, the podcast for wannabe fiction writers, and I am your hapless host, Mer Lafferty. This is the last of the episodes I had recorded in February. And you know, that's old Monty Python sketch where, you built a castle on the swamp, but it sank into the swamp, and then you built another castle and it sank into the swamp, and you built another castle and it burned down, fell over, and then sank into the swamp. That's been my couple of weeks. I failed to get this production done before my trip, and I came back from my trip and immediately got sick with not one but two different infections. And now I've got some personal stuff with a relative in the hospital, and so things keep just kicking me in the teeth, and you don't need to know about that. What you need to know is that it's delayed podcasting stuff, and I apologize to Rachel and Preemie and Natania for getting their episodes out so late. But I'm not going to talk much because I need to get this out. I need to get this uploaded and out, and then actually take the time I wanted to take to work on the podcast and the Patreon and all that stuff. But one thing that I got out of the JoCo Cruise was I'd forgotten how nice it is to spend time with other creative people. And it's not that I sat around and brainstormed or anything, just spending time with other people who create amazing things made me start to, come up with my own ideas. And it was really nice to feel that way. So I'm going to recommend to you, surround yourself with creative people. And I know that's tougher than it sounds, a lot tougher than it sounds, but it's still worthwhile. Do an accountability check-in with some creative friends to talk about how many words you've written. Talk about books you've read online to get other people started talking. I think one thing that lockdown did to us is make us feel like being alone is the standard. Being alone is the status quo. And I'm speaking from somebody who works from home already, so maybe I'm just projecting, and those of you who are back in work among people don't feel this anymore. But when I was on the cruise, I remembered what it was like to be around creative people. One of my best friends, Ursula Vernon, has moved to Albuquerque, and I used to have that with her, and I miss her greatly. But I can still talk to her. We have the internet. It's easier to talk to people now than ever. So I don't have a lot to complain about. I just have to do some work, which is to connect with people and talk about creative stuff. Or not even talk about creative stuff. There's just something about being around other people who make cool stuff that fires up my brain. I've got a lot to think about and consider with the future of this podcast, and no, this is not some sort of dire, I might quit. It's been 20 years. I'm wondering if anything needs to be changed. If you have any thoughts, email me, mightymer@gmail.com. I'm interested. One thing I'm interested in is if you would like to hear from people who do more than fiction. I get approached by a lot of nonfiction writers and publicists who write about writing or about creativity. The only people I've had on the show that do that are usually people who I already trust and know. And I'm not saying these other people are not trustworthy. I'm just saying if I know I like something somebody has to say regarding writing, then I'll have them on the show. But otherwise, there are a lot of writing podcasts out there. I'm just lucky you guys are listening to me. But if you want to hear from people like that, let me know. But I'm not going to dilly-dally much longer. I'm going to get into the conversation I have with Natania Barron, good friend, medieval scholar of fabric and clothing and history and food and all sorts of stuff. She is so much fun to talk to. So let's go talk to her. welcome back to I Should Be Writing. I am here with Natania Barron, very prolific fantasy author, and a good friend of mine lives down the road in the Triangle. So, Natania, welcome. I'm glad to have you.
Thank you for having me, Mer. I'm so excited.
Oh, and also Hugo Award nominated podcaster. I keep forgetting.
Yes.
You're with World Building for Masochists, right?
I am. So this is some good podcast on podcast Matryoshka situation. So
it definitely is. People in chat are already commenting about your book nook, your spiffy new book nook behind you.
Yes, this is my pride and joy, very much so.
I feel like I'm the only writer who, started doing video during the time of COVID that I don't have my background as books. It's like I've got one bookshelf in this room and it came last year. So I have never had a lot of books in this room that are not like stacked up on the floors. This is just not the book where we keep the room where we keep the books. So I just always feel like I did something wrong with my room.
This was planned though. This was orchestrated. So this is our third floor. It's just been finished. So I got to actually plan how I wanted the desk and where I wanted the things. And I have very green wallpaper, which is not arsenic laced, but reminds me of arsenic laced wallpaper. And just given the current climate, I am redoubling my efforts to buy as many physical books as possible.
Yeah.
And I have extra shelf space. So
nice.
Yeah, we have a huge amount of books here. We're going to do some more bookshelves downstairs, but yeah, I didn't have this before either. This is quite new. So
nice.
Our big grown-up project, which my husband said he felt more like a grown-up doing a third floor renovation than having children because it felt there's so much more forethought, it turns out, into that.
This is a tangent. I don't know if it's even going to make it into the podcast, but I have felt I've discovered a new level of I'm an adult and I'm not apologizing for it this year, which is we've been in this house over 20 years. We just replaced all the toilets. And I'm just like, I live in luxury now.
Yes. Oh, man. Yes.
Just the little things, man.
It's very cool when you get to be like, oh, I can just do that because I am an adult. And that was how we did this because we were thinking of moving to another house, and market's stupid right now and it wouldn't really make sense. So we were like, why don't we just do this? So yeah, we have a whole situation up here, which is pretty cool. And I have
Lovely.
A witch window up there, which is very nice.
What is that? What is a witch window?
So, well, it's not technically a witch window, but it looks like one. It's a diamond shaped window. In New England, you found them very often in old houses, and they were these weird sort of rectangular windows that often looked like they didn't quite belong in the place, but they've kind of encompassed to call any of these kind of oddly shaped windows witch windows. We decided that we wanted a diamond shape because it would just look really cool.
Nice.
So, and I have a little rainbow catcher in there that when the sun's out, the whole room has rainbows going around it.
Wow.
Very ethereal and nerdy. So
that's lovely. I have adjusted the video so that you guys can see the tiny little window above Natania's head. So yeah, you have you're really smart, Natania. I'm opening this really well. I told you it's been a rough week. I mean,
it has, yes.
So it's like you write these beautiful romantic Arthurian inspired books, and but you also are a fashion historian and a food historian. So I see you talk about writing on TikTok and Instagram and stuff, and see you get consulted and stuff. So tell us about, let's start with the Queens of Fate books, because the newest one is coming out in June.
Yes.
And so we'll start with that, and then we'll move on to all the other magic stuff you do.
Sure. Well, I mean, I always joke that it was the thesis I never got to write. It was the first book. So I started Queen of None in 2010, 2011.
Wow.
And I was not too long at that point that I got my master's degree in medieval English. And up until I had my son, my hope was that I was going to go and be a professor. I wanted to teach Middle English, medieval English, Arthurian romance, that kind of thing. And then I realized I really didn't like college students. And the whole reality of having to teach courses to people who didn't want to be there was just not something I felt that I had the right temperament to do.
Yeah.
And this is no shade on any academic. I think you are amazing, amazing human beings. But I actually interviewed at UNC for a PhD position, and the interview went extremely well. And it was beautiful, beautiful autumn in Chapel Hill. And I walked out of the interview with the head of the department, and I just wasn't excited. And I told my husband, I said, I think I'm done. Like, I should be so excited. This should be one of those like watershed moments.
Yeah.
And so it was a couple of rough years because my training was all in school. I've been going to school for a billion years. So that's kind of how I discovered marketing as a side career, because turns out you can make money writing, and a lot of people don't know how to write, which is a pretty, it took me by surprise. But at the same time, I was writing these stories, and I had discovered the character. I'm not the first person to discover her, but in Geoffrey of Monmouth, which is one of the earliest 12th century extant manuscripts we have of the King Arthur story, kind of sketched out as a history. It mentions that Arthur has a full-blooded sister named Anna, who comes from the same unification of his mother, and Uther Pendragon, who very, very not well takes his mother. And I thought, wow, what if your brother was the king? Your half-sisters were all supposedly witches. Your mom was like died of sadness. Your dad was this warlord. What would your life be like? And that's really where her story started. So the stories have been different women in each of the books. But the idea is that it's sort of like the story behind the stories that we see with King Arthur. Yeah.
So how much history did you find out about this person, and how much did you invent?
Well, this is the bizarre thing that's so much fun is that, King Arthur stories, Arthuriana, they also call it the Matter of Britain. It's fan fiction. Like, it's 100% fan fiction. So there's no canon, despite what people like Zack Snyder says. There's no one story. So sometimes she's called Anna. Eventually she gets kind of absorbed by her other sisters. And so you see Morgause, and you see Morgan kind of taking on the same story. But early on, her children are the nephews of the king. So it's Gawain, Gareth, Gaheris. And that sort of family is what I adopted. And that certainly exists. Those characters are from almost the very beginning of the story, through the French retellings, through all of the Mallory stories, and kind of putting them all together. And even if you watch Excalibur, quite a lot of those characters still make it. But it's just, things get shuffled around so much. So characters can be villainous for the first couple hundred years, and then 500 years later, they're the heroes, right? People are always taking the stories and retelling them. So I didn't have to rely too much on it. I mean, I believe that King Arthur is ahistorical. And I really wanted to tell sort of a version through the pre-Raphaelite look in terms of like aesthetics. It's not really historically the 9th century.
Yeah.
It's the imagined 9th century of the Victorians. So the language is more Victorian, some of the social structures and things. But still, it's still very much it's almost secondary world fantasy, but not quite. So I play a lot with names because the names also change so much. I'm a total name nerd, and names are just spelled 500 different ways. I think one of my favorites is Sir Sagramore. If you go to the Wikipedia page for him, there's like a paragraph of all the different ways that his name is spelled.
Wow.
Through the 1500 years that he's in these stories. So, yeah.
Nice. Sorry, trying to catch up with chat. Space Valkyries is here. Hello. Love a good fanfic. And Crystal Briar says they would have loved the type of classes you just described. So but yeah, also would think, I think Underpope thought of himself in college. Jeez, I cannot talk today. Thought of himself in college and says, yeah, I was insufferable, so he understands where you're coming from. And yeah, I always had that. I thought I could get my master's in popular fiction, which means I could teach as a fallback. And then thought, I don't want to. I did a little bit of teaching at Stone Coast after I left, after I got my degree. And it was just still like, does no one know how to use quotation marks?
No, the answer is no.
How did this? And they want to be writers and they can't use quotation. So, Yeah, I'm not a good teacher. This is as far as I go, that just talking into a microphone and answering questions if people
Oh yeah,
have them.
I could have been a lecturer or researcher, like for sure, but those don't exist anymore in academia, right?
Oh.
Like you really have. I mean, you can to some extent, but not in English. I mean, I loved finding old Middle English manuscripts that people hadn't really read a lot and kind of sitting there and translating them and stuff. But like, there's no money in that. There's no private funding to go into like, finding that stuff, unfortunately. But I still do it. I mean, one of my favorite subjects in the Middle Ages is illuminated manuscripts, and they're just proof that people are always weird. And and I love that. I love looking at art from, 900 years ago and being like, oh, they liked butts as much as we do. Like they think they're funny. And so they have a trumpet there because you also fart. And so farting through a trumpet with your butt is like super funny. And I'm like, I mean, most humans at some point in their life will also laugh at that, right?
Yeah. At some point, I like how you did that side part. That's fun. So yeah,
Monty Python gets so right, by the way. So Monty Python and the Holy Grail is actually a very surprisingly accurate medieval film because the Terry Jones was actually a medieval scholar, and so much of what they pulled there, like the killer rabbits, is exactly from medieval manuscripts. There's so many. Their
really?
hair, but they in the margins they'll be like beating people up with like clubs, and no one really knows why. But they took that as something that like they turned into the movie, which I think is just so cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm so amazed at all of your fashion and food knowledge. It's, I think we talked about whether, Europe focused or worldwide focused before we recorded. So, what I want to ask actually is, it's been, critiqued that what a lot of us in the Western world think of as fantasy is the Victorian era or earlier of England. But you said that the fashion, is like worldwide because England took from so many. So, I guess talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, many people are familiar with the Silk Road, right? We don't in this day. Ever since industrialization, where you could literally get something off of a rack and put it on your body, that's only about 130 years old of time, right? Up until the turn of the last century, everyone had clothes made for your body, period. So the fabric that you had was one of the most precious things that you could have on your person. They were given as dowries. We see dresses that were made and remade over sometimes hundreds of years because that material is so valuable. The amount of labor that goes into creating a silk garment is it's beyond our own ability to really calculate. Like we are so completely separate from that now in our lives. So the search for, these beautiful fabrics really propelled this at the same time where we see the Spice Road, right? So there's a lot of really interesting parallels. And on the tails of that comes colonialism, right? It's not just we're exploring, it suddenly becomes we're giving them very, very big quotation marks here. Our culture, we want to live here because we think it's good, or we just want to control the means of production. So much of it comes down to the means of production, right? Cotton's a great example. It can only grow in a handful of environments. You need heat and you need really, really humid air for it to grow. Well, outside of parts of Egypt and parts of the Indian subcontinent, one of the only places that you can find that is where?
Here.
The American South. And when they figured that out, they were like, oh, but there's a whole bunch of Native Americans on this land. So what are we going to do? We're going to push them out. And then they were like, okay, now we have all this land. Who's going to actually do this horrible job of picking cotton? And then comes in the international slave trade. So the domino effect of the demand for materials and cotton up until the point where it became sort of an American bumper crop, people were using linen, they were using wool, they were using silk. They had to basically hype up cotton to become this thing. And now everything's cotton for the most part, at least in the fabric of our lives concept, right? But it was actually not as commonly used. And so you see these sort of like ricochets and ripples of these decisions. And so much of it comes back to how the age of quote unquote discovery becomes this imperialist approach to try to, especially from the side of England, because they were of course fighting with everyone else as well, but they also brought back things. So, I love the Regency period from an aesthetic point of view, but so much of that is literally just taken whole hog from India. The Mughal lords that were there, they would the stupid British folks would come and with their guns and scare people and basically take so many of their sacred things. Like if you ever watch, any Jane Austen film, the women are wearing pashminas, which are these cashmere little shawls. Those were initially like symbols of, status and all kinds of things that were literally just picked up and like given to wives, and it became a fashion statement. Same thing happened 100 years before with chintz pattern. So chintz is now like, it's chintzy, but it's actually a specific cotton block print, which also originated in India. And it was initially a fabric for furniture. And the women who were working the furniture mills would take small pieces of it and sort of assemble their own outfits out of it. And the rich white women thought, oh, this is cool, but we don't want them wearing it. So they started actually fining people for wearing chintz. And then the rich people were the only ones who could get it. And then there were these like sumptuary laws on top of that. And then eventually women were demonized for wearing this. It was called pagan designs and whatnot, and attacked in the streets. So we have instances of women who were wearing these dresses that are these cotton print dresses, and people throwing nitric acid on them, throwing fecal matter at them, they used to call them calico bitches and scream at them. Especially the Quakers really hated women wearing calico.
The Quakers?
The Quakers, yeah. So, just a very, very, sorry, not the Quakers. Sorry, not the Quakers, the other ones. Maybe it was the Quakers. I'll have to double check. It's one of the super, super early regimented Protestant groups, 17th century. I'll have to go look. But anyway, there's a lot of religious opposition to this kind of stuff, but eventually it all gets absorbed back into the sort of fashion culture, right? And all the silk that we have, of course, came from Japan and from China. And a lot of times you find these beautiful gowns and it's like, oh, this was actually cut from this priceless, kimono that they refashioned because they just could. We almost don't have an idea even of how expensive things were because the scale is just so different. It's just our own scale of I think one of the stats that I often cite is that in 1 year, Henry VIII spent about $3 million equivalent on clothing. And his daughter had over 2,000 dresses in her wardrobe, which even by today's standards is a lot. Knowing what went into those gowns, we're talking in some cases the equivalent about $10,000 a gown for the production of something like that in our money. So yeah, I mean, it's very much the spirit of we'll get whatever we can get our hands on and incorporate it into our food, into our clothing, just like we did with food, right? We found a new ingredient, pepper, right? Pepper took the world by storm because it was so drastically different. One of my favorite maps, you can actually see what like fruits and vegetables are native to an area, and you realize how little is actually in Western Europe. And almost all of it came from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia over time. So it is just this, it's global, but it's also so rooted in particularly imperialist approaches to colonialism.
Yeah. So we're writing fantasy, which is made up stuff. You're basing yours in a fanfic from a very specific era in history.
Yeah.
What, I guess in the terms of, we laugh at people who say dragons are cool, but female rulers, nuh-uh. And so with that extreme view in mind, what responsibility do you think people have in writing fantasy? I mean, first basing it off of history, or if they want to go wider, which, why is all fantasy sounding like it's from Western Europe? But then there's the appropriation thing. So what responsibilities do you think various people have when it comes to writing fantasy?
I mean, I think for me, different book series have different approaches to it. Like I wanted within the Arthurian stories for it to still almost be like there could be this supreme male narrative happening in the background, but there's this whole other story that you can't see. And I do believe that for all of human history, there has been that. Women have been doing things that for the most part were erased, right?
Yeah.
I was just telling my husband about, I just got really mad because I was reading yet another story that said, and all of her letters were burned when she died. Like this, like, and it happens so often, right? Their families, once that uppity woman who knew how to read and had lots of correspondence kicked the bucket, we just burned all in hopes that she would have no influence later. So in some ways, it's kind of reclaiming that for me, I think is important. I am critical of continually telling stories that all are in a Western-centric world. So I hope to bring something different to it. I'm hoping to put a different angle on it, on something that I'm particularly passionate about. But you know, it's also the stories that are stories for me. Like it's the stories that I can tell that have meant something for me. And I was always the kid where like, where are the girls in this story? Like the Knights at the Round Table, where were the girls? We're still, I mean, you and I are of an age that like, it was rare to find a story where a woman was given any kind of agency or power. If she was maybe lucky, she could be a sidekick or a plot point. For me, it was reading Madeleine L'Engle, and just reading A Wrinkle in Time was just a watershed moment for me. And I was like, oh, she's weird like me. Like she feels feelings like I do. And she's still able to be a hero. So I think that's sort of like my thing. I think that it is important to open up your eyes from a world building perspective, especially if you're writing secondary worlds that have lots of things going on. I think that's where I get frustrated, is when I read a story, I'm like, really, you could have done anything you ever wanted in the entire world, and you decided to basically make it just like our world. Like we talk a lot about this on the show on world building for masochists, that like choose, don't presume, right? I think the danger comes in presuming that everyone thinks that there's a fantasy blueprint and that if you're writing a fantasy book, it looks like X. And so I'm always trying to break those rules. I'm always trying to play with them and change the story a little bit. So that's kind of how I approach it.
The talk in the chat is that your discussion is riveting, so keep it up. So one thing I found out about you just the other night when we went to go see Michelle Tracy Berger's book launch was I didn't realize you were also an expert on the food of the time, which I find food fascinating. I haven't written a whole lot about it. I haven't put it in my own stuff, but I still find it really interesting, especially when other people do. Tell me about your training with that and how it comes into your books.
Well, you know, one of the cool things about being a medievalist, which I use that term pretty widely, is that it's going to be interdisciplinary no matter what you do. And what I loved about my studies was that I could kind of enter into the world from an angle where I wanted to know what it smelled like, what it, you know, like what the food tasted like. And I've always loved to cook. So when I was about 11, I just started working my way through the joy of cooking. And my parents I love them. Love you, parents, if you're probably not listening, but even if you were, terrible cooks. I mean, my mom makes a handful of really great French Canadian recipes. But I wouldn't say French Canadian food is like, you know, haute couture or food necessarily. It's good. It's very stick to your ribs. But I got so much, and this is, you know, young, undiagnosed ADHD kid. I love spending time by myself, and I loved making things. And I was the kid that looked at a loaf of bread and was like, so why do we eat bread? How does it rise? What is it made out of? And so I ask an exorbitant amount of questions in my life. And that's where sort of learning about the history of food. And then when you're doing a medieval degree, it comes up so often because the whole world really revolved around the kind of food that you could eat. And most of it was pretty terrible. And most of it's very different because depending on the time, you wouldn't have access, like just sugar, right? Sugar did not really exist en masse until we were able to, through the joy of imperialism once again, right? So the West Indies and kind of like the plantations of sugar, that really changed everything. People didn't eat that much sugar up to that point. Or if they did, it was honey. It was, you know, small amounts of it that you could import. So controlling those means of supply is a huge part of that. So I love kind of going back in time and saying, okay, what would this meal have actually looked like? And there's a great, I think it's one of the the houses that they have been sort of like preserved from the Tudor period, where they actually cook the recipes from the books that they had at that period. And like everything has lard in it. They're making like a cherry pie. And
Oh,
like,
of course.
Lard is what you use, because having a dairy cow to the amounts of there's not the land, it's just easier to have lard because you're cooking huge amounts of meat. But some of the things like cookies are really, really old. The concept of eating cookies, they're small, portable, sweet little things that you can put in your pocket and travel really well. So are pies, right? You're just preserving something inside in a crust. The things that are newer are things like cakes, right? Cakes have more sophisticated leavening, and the older cakes still use yeast. So you can find recipes that still use yeast to rise a sweet cake. But also our tastes change just dramatically. People often are surprised how much spices that food had from the Middle Ages, but they're just not the kind of palate that we're accustomed to, right? The sweet, savory ideas are just very, very, very different. So, but some of them are not, like poached pears. I mean, we've been doing that for a really long time. Absolutely delicious. Take a fragrant liquid, put your fruit in it. It sweetens it up and kind of infuses it, and it's wonderful. So I think it's all just a matter of just, very difficult to satiate curiosity about stuff. And I love learning. I've been doing a whole dive into French food. And I learned that in the 17th and 18th centuries, the average French man in Paris, working class or lower, ate about 3 pounds of bread a day. 3 pounds of bread a day. It was really what kept people alive, was bread. And then when the crops failed, there was like this long winter period. Everyone just died. People just died. They didn't have things to fall back on. Tons of onions too. Onions, cabbages, things that grow. Having just been in Paris in the middle of winter, I can tell you it's miserable. But yeah, it gives us we have such a width and breadth of food, just like we're able to do with fashion. We can get whatever we want, right? If you really want strawberries in the middle of winter, you can get strawberries in the middle of winter. But through all time, through all cultures, you had to plan ahead. And it was between life and death, really, for most people. But if you were super rich, you could just eat everyone else's food. But you got rice and you got meat. I mean, people didn't, it's not that they didn't like meat. They just didn't have access to meat. So meat was often the bones and the broth. And you made something in the Middle Ages called pottage, which was basically lots of vegetables, oats in a broth that you would just cook and cook and cook, and you would eat.
Well, not tasty. That sounds like a lot healthier than, 3 pounds of bread.
Yeah. But the bread was rougher too. So that's the other thing to remember, is that it was a bit grainier. The idea of fully wheat-free bread is more of a technology invention of later times. But it wasn't that far on. But yeah, in some ways, but they were also super active, right? So you had to work like hell every day. Yeah. So. I feel enough, white guilt. Now you're giving me like 21st century guilt, Natania. I can't. Yeah, we have that too. Handle all of this. I mean, I get it though. I'm trying to grow, like, herbs are one of the coolest things. Like so young in my life, I discovered cilantro, and I know that it's very polarizing, but I love cilantro. And I just remember like eating it for the first time and being like, this is just a plant. This is just a plant doing all the work here. And as I've been cooking through these really French peasant food meals, almost every single one of them has like 3 times more herbs than I would normally cook with. And the result is just phenomenal. Like everything just tastes like it's turned up to 11, right? Because you're caramelizing onions and you're bathing stuff in a bouquet garni. And like, these are not old concepts or new concepts. They're super old. We just brown our onions and then like throw everything in because we're crushed for time. What I love about French food, I joke though, it's like sometimes my ADHD gets the better of me because it's a lot of waiting. So yeah, it's an interesting like kind of pathway into something that I didn't have a lot of experience from, even though I come from a Francophone family. So yeah, I mean, food, I could definitely write a whole book on the connections between food and fabric. You could totally do something that weaves the two of them together, pun intended. I know. Yeah. I'm sorry. Mar.
It's all right.
I'm allowed one, right?
You're the guest. You can do as many as you want. But if you start going off into the doing a pun and then watching me.
No.
Yeah, that's no.
Yeah, I remember I took a cooking class. I was kind of after I had my kid, just kind of in a, what do I want to do with my life? I didn't want to go back into web design. And so I thought I would take a cooking class and like get a sense of maybe I could become a personal chef or something. Discovered I cannot become a personal chef. I don't have the palate to create recipes. That's really it. But, I remember that's where I got knife skills, and the teacher was, threw a lot of history at us, which I really appreciated. And one of them was like when slaves would butcher an animal, they would, of course, give all the prime cuts of meat to their owners, and they'd have to keep like all the organ stuff for themselves. So they had to learn how they created these dishes with these organ meats that we now know are incredibly rich and very, full of iron. And so of course then the masters are like, what are you guys eating? Well, no, you can't, that's too good. You can't. So they take that, and it's fascinating on an academic level and really depressing on a empathy level of how these things have evolved.
Yep. And so much of what we consider Southern cooking is, in fact, the cooking of enslaved people who were here that it eventually became absorbed into what we call Southern food. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much we can learn about travel and about ownership and culture by looking at the kinds of foods people eat in different cultures. It's really collards are just literally lifted from the greens that were eaten in the Mediterranean and in Africa as well. We eat such a tiny amount of greens compared to what some of the healthiest people in the world, which eat so many more than we do. And my first time I had collards, I was disgusted. I was like this, I was expecting spinach, like me and my New England in. But now I make them, and my husband says that they're even better than his mom's. But I do a quick braise method. She does the stew method where it cooks for like 4 hours. I like a quick braise. So mine are still a little green, but they're tender. It has a bell curve. Cabbages have, well, at least these ones have a curve. Like either you cook them fast or you cook them slow. In the middle, they're going to be like chewing rubber. Yeah. The textures of collards is often what turns me off. But if you can get a good recipe and a good chef, then you should be I love set. So this is not, so going back to your books, The Queens of Fate is not your only series you're working on. You also have Netherford Hall out, and that's a new series. Can you tell us about that? So Love in Netherford was that series was kind of, it literally came to me in a dream, sort of like as I was falling asleep, which doesn't usually happen. I usually have a little more forethought. But I really always wanted, as a bisexual person, I really wanted a story that was sort of rooted in an Austinian world, but between two women. So I wanted this sort of sapphic retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but of course I'm a fantasy author, so I wanted magic to be there. I wanted some kind, and I was playing around with this idea of what a gentle witch would be. So instead of a gentleman, it's a gentle witch, like a whole layer of British society that are these women that have a lot of magic, but is also they're represented in Parliament, and they have important positions, and how that would change the world. And that's kind of what got the whole story started. And then it ended up being about this little town called Netherford in Kent, which I was lucky to visit Kent when I was young. Such a beautiful part of, a lot of England is beautiful, but in particular, a really beautiful part of England. And, I wanted it to be sexy and silly. Like, that's so much of what Austen is. There's like, yes, there's a dirty underbelly, but you're also just there for the feels and the shipping and all of that stuff as well. So that's there is that level. And the second book just came out, which is the Viscount St. Albans. Each book follows a different sort of pair, but you still get all the other characters throughout. So it's definitely a large cast. If you don't like lots of characters, it's probably not for you. But I like having sort of a cast of characters, and there's werewolves and there's vampires and there's, fae creatures and things like that, all kind of woven into, it's like between 1814 and 1820. Then lots of fashion. Fashion plays a really big part in it.
Of course. And so your first one is out?
The first two are out. So Netherford Hall and the Viscount St. Albans just came out last week, the 14th.
Right. Congrats.
And Solaris Nova, which is an imprint of Solaris Books, which does my other books. So
okay.
And I have the same editor for all of them, which is wonderful.
Yeah. If you find a good editor, you don't want to lose them. Yeah, apologies to people in chat. I usually get the author's links ready in the chat, and I did not do so today. It's like I said, bad brandy. I'm so sorry, Natania, but
pretty easy to find. There's not a lot on with out there. So.
They are easy to find, and the links will definitely be in the show notes, so you'll be able to find Natania's stuff anywhere. Do you have signed books like coming from Flyleaf or something?
I don't at the moment. I need to get on that.
Yeah, I mean they carry your books, so you can just say, hey, you guys can get signed books from Flyleaf and go in and sign a bunch, because that's what they do for me and did for Ursula. So it's definitely something you should do that.
I know.
So give Natania a couple of weeks and then order her books from Flyleaf and say, hey, I want them signed, and there you go.
I'm doing an event at Quail Ridge Books in June on the day of the release of the third book. So if anyone happens to be around, you can get tickets for that. And that'll be fun. A mutual friend, Sam Montgomery Blinn, is going to be interviewing me about the 3 books. Wife in particular is a really big fan, which is pretty lovely when you find the person that you're like, oh, apparently I wrote this book for you. Like that's the cool thing. Like I wrote it for me, but apparently I wrote it for you too.
Yeah. So we were talking a little bit about the state of the world and moods, and I can't remember who said it, and I apologize if someone's listening and they're to say that they said it, but I heard the phrase activity is optimism. And what that's kind of becoming my phrase of late, because when I get depressed because of various things going on in the world, it makes me want to, crawl into a hole with a blanket and curl up and do nothing. But I remember that I have responsibility is a little bit too strong of a word, because, authors don't owe anybody anything, but I want to bring works to people that give them joy and give them escapism. And knowing that if I keep writing, that in itself is optimism. I know you and I've talked a lot about escapism, so I wanted to see what you thought about that sort of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I discovered books at a very, very young age. Like and my mom doesn't remember me not reading. Like by the time I got to kindergarten, I was reading, right? And books have always been a refuge for me. I didn't have the hardest childhood in the world, but I had a very sick father, and I had a lot of things going on that made me grow up really fast. And I didn't learn the term maladaptive daydreaming until much later. But that is essentially what I would do, right? I would come home from school and I would just read for hours and hours and hours. And that eventually turned into writing for hours and hours and hours. By the time I was 12 or 13, I was basically writing Stephen King fan fiction, hours and hours at a time, inserting myself into various stories as one does. I didn't even know that was a thing, right? Because this is before the internet was big. I'm sorry, I got to ask which stories? The Stand.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So, the really uplifting end of the world pandemic stuff that in no way whatsoever reflected anything real happening to human beings.
No.
But I love character-based stories, and being a young person in the 90s, Stephen King was everywhere, right? And he wrote fantasy as well. And I discovered Tolkien when I was around 14, and that was like the right age, right? It was like, that's why I became a medievalist. I didn't know what that was until I learned that that's what he did at Oxford and teaching all that stuff. But in terms of escapism, it is a gift, and it is a gift to keep writing. I do love the word vocation, which comes from the Latin to be called to do something, vocare, with your voice. I remember a teacher mentioning that when I was in school and thinking like, that's always how it's been with me with writing. Like, it's great that I can publish, and I love hearing from people that they stayed up all night to read my book, or I broke their heart, or like, they're never going to be the same, or even if they didn't like it, that's still great. Like, hey, something that you don't like, that's great. It's good to know. But I would be doing it anyway. Like, stories are how I make sense of the world. My emotions are always at a delay. Like, I live in a house of people who feel their emotions in the moment. And I'm like, that's cool. I'm not going to know what I really felt about this for a couple of weeks. And then I'm probably going to ruminate on it for a while. And then I'm probably going to figure out how to write it into a story. And that's, a therapist says that's fine. Like, honestly, people have so many more very destructive habits with this stuff. I've been able to shape it into something that's art. And so I think of it that way too, but I'm very much like you. I didn't even know I had depression until because the depression in my family is very much the like sad, hollow-eyed, wandering around crying kind of depression. Mine was like, I'm going to go under my blankets and not come out for a couple of days, just like complete non-movement. And I'm usually a very active person. So I totally agree. And sometimes it's like starting something small. Like I'm just going to pick up the book next to me. I'm going to read 3 paragraphs. And then once I start like to get out of that, I start to be able to start moving again. And the joints are a little rusty and things don't get moving, but keeping yourself and your soul sort of fulfilled as you're doing the work, because you have to feed both. You can't just write and not actually fill your own bucket with words and stories, however the medium is. Like I play a ton of video games. I love video game narrative. For me, it's not a distraction from my writing. It's a way I think about narrative in a different way. So
I've put more than one video game character into my books. So I'm definitely with you on that. And I even had Gordon Van Gelder come up and ask me if my book 6 Weeks was based on, I think, something from Ursula K. Le Guin, and I should have just lied. I really should have, but no. I said nope. Got that from the video game FTL. Yeah, yeah. So I'm literary.
I think Larian in the beginning of my most recent book, because so much of that book is because I would literally reward myself afterwards. I would write for 2 hours or whatever my word count for the day was, and then I would go play the game. And it really, we've shared our mutual dorky love of Baldur's Gate 3, but like to me, it leveled up so much on a narrative level that was just so nuanced and incredible. And I absolutely stole parts of Astarion for my character Roland in those books, because I just love this over the top. But if you scratch a little bit, you see how broken and sad the man is. Something, I can fix him. But yeah, I think I really very much dislike this idea that you can't do both. I think some people just, same thing argument people get about like comic books, right? That's not, it's not real narrative. Bull honky.
Yeah. You can say whatever you like. I can bleep stuff out later. Yeah, no, I'm definitely with you. We got Space Valkyries in fiction. I am often less, I can fix him, and more, I love this trash man. Look at that garbage. Amazing.
A little bit of that.
Yeah.
I also love a fop. Like I've always loved the sort of like, like more femme presenting men who are okay with dressing up ridiculously and sort of having character and mannerisms that are sort of not patrolled by toxic masculinity. That's always been, I just love getting into it, and especially someone that doesn't give a shit about it. And in this world, it's queer normative. So you can be whoever the hell you want to be. There's no, that's one thing that you will, in those books, you will never get. And the Queen books, it's different. It's more complicated. There is quite a few number of queer stories, but depending on your level of power, just like it was in history, depends on how visible that can be to the world around you, right? But in the Netherford Hall books, that's just an option. Anyone can marry anybody. They've figured out the way around it.
That's excellent. If anybody in the chat has questions for Natania, now's the time to tell us. Otherwise, we will just keep chatting, because I could just keep going. We see each other far too infrequently, I think. But you do a lot of travel, right?
I do for my day job. Yeah. Yes, so travel quite a bit. Yeah.
What is next for you after you finish these series?
It's a good question. I have, sorry, I talk with my hands too much. I'm hitting my microphone. It's not like I do this professionally or anything. I have some ideas. There's still a couple stories in Arthuriana that I really want to tell. One especially being Sir Palamedes, who is the Middle Eastern knight. So this is canonical that he came from the Middle East, and he was what I did most of my research on, this idea of this intersection of sort of the courtly concepts of Persia, and then later obviously different countries and different groups within that sort of melding with England, and that character would be like, as well as, and that story intertwines with the Tristan and Isolde story. So I would love a chance to do some more of those. I have a romantasy book that I wrote that I need to edit. And so that's probably one that I'm going to get to. And then I really want to write a book on perfume and the history of perfume. So
cool.
It's another one of my nerdy things, which it's definitely connected to fashion, but looking at the science and the culture behind how we smell and how different things in different cultures smell. It's so sciencey. It's so rooted in so much of what we know about science is because people were making perfumes for like thousands of years.
Wow.
All the way back to Sumeria. But then eventually I'd love to do a thread talk book. I think the hard part about that is just picking, there's so many topics. So I think I'd like to do my first one on chintz and calico, because I think that's just it's a cool, there's like subterfuge and spies and like all kinds of stuff alongside that. So that might be one. So it's never a problem with ideas. Mm-hmm. So if one thing is it doesn't going to work with my agent, we'll do something else. Yeah. We can be flexible. I just have to finish this last book. I've been on deadline for 2 years now. So I'm going to look forward to taking a little bit of a break.
Well, you still, there are other writers who are way, way, way ahead of you. So don't worry about that with late books. Questions from the chat. We have the ultimate writer question, plotter or pantser? I'm a plantser. So I'm also a Gemini. It's a little bit of both. Some books are pretty detailed plot-wise. I'll sometimes use a 7-point plot and kind of write it to that. But I have found myself going back to a more organic approach. With retellings, it's kind of cheating because I already have the bones of the story and I'm kind of just playing around in that world, right? With that's the great thing about fan fiction in general. But yeah, I can go both ways as it turns out. Okay. Any good resources for people starting to look into fashion history or food history?
Oh gosh, there's so many books. The book that I always recommend for food and the senses and all of that stuff, there's a book by hold on, I'm gonna find it. It's called the History of the Senses. A Natural History. Diane Ackerman is the one. I read this book when I was in undergrad in a sort of like essay course, and it is a phenomenal like entry level into how humans experience stuff, like how we smell, how we taste, and there's a lot in there about how taste and things have evolved, which is just really, really cool. And there's a whole section of, maybe not that one, but there's a couple. There's another book, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it literally is like the history of apples, which is, I'm sure Chuck Wendig would know exactly the book, but it takes a look at how the apple started and how the fact now that like you can't, if you have a Granny Smith apple and you cut it open and you put the seeds in the ground, you're going to get like 12 different kinds of apples, right? Because apples are grafted and they're selectively bred to have a certain kind of fruit. And you can trace it all the way back to, I believe it's Afghanistan where they initially started. And they were these little tiny, almost like cherries, right? Little tiny, tiny fruits. And over thousands and thousands of years, we have learned how to do this very scientific approach, which is like hacking off a part of it and grafting it somewhere else, to take these strains and create different flavors and textures and all kinds of stuff like that. So I love the science angle. I find Michael Pollan's books really, really fun and accessible for learning about food. History in fashion is challenging because there's been a lot less research done because it was considered like a woman's thing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really good academic writing that I found. So I use JSTOR a lot. But in terms of like overall fashion, it's really hard to find those things. Most of the stuff I've done is like research on my own. There's a couple of books that I have. Oh, I cannot remember the name of it, but it's basically like the role of women in the creation of fashion from the beginning of the world, basically, and how women who were, this was a job you could do with a child on your hip, right? Because you could sit at a loom and you could make things. And we know that they've been doing that for forever and ever and ever. And that's usually the lowest on the whole, hierarchy of making stuff. It's probably over there behind me I think it's called Women's Work. Hold on. Is it Women's Work? Yeah. Yeah, it's called Women's Work, the first 20,000 years. Women, cloth, and society in early times.
Cool.
Super, super, super cool. And then I have a book on sumptuary laws that I love too, but that's another, it's an academic press piece, because the whole fact that people used to, and in some cases still do, police the things people wear, and only let certain people wear certain things. It's pretty fascinating. So those are two good spots to start. But if you have access to JSTOR, there's so, like, fashion history is human history. So my advice is always to find a time period that you're interested in. And then you can always find through archaeological records. The Met Museum has great resources. A lot of small museums have fantastic resources, and a lot of extant materials. I got to visit my favorite dress in the world in Scotland when we were there this summer, when we saw you as well, at the Scottish Museum in Edinburgh, and it was one of the coolest things ever. So some of these pieces are still alive. We're still living, awesome. still around. I don't know if they're living, but it could be haunted.
True.
It's undead, but.
Do you have multiple deadlines? And if so, how do you cope?
I do have multiple. Thankfully, these ones have been at the same time. Like I've had a break in between to kind of go from one. I met every single deadline except this last one. So I am driven by adrenaline and spite to fuel my ADHD. So I work pretty well with a deadline. If you give me a deadline, I'm 65,000 words into a 90,000 word story. So I'm almost there.
Nice.
I'm there. But I do it almost every day. It's just become, I used to be like a word counter, just constantly looking at word count. I write much slower now than I used to, but I keep a lot more. So even though I do a lot of editing, but to me, it's like, I don't know. It's not as, I don't do as much rewriting. I used to do a lot of rewriting, where instead of editing, I would literally go back and rewrite the book over and over and over again. Now I'm a little slower. I usually write maybe between 500 and 1,000 words a day, because I have a full-time job and kids and dogs and stuff. But yeah, I mean, at that rate though, if I can kind of make that a little bit more, I mean, I started with NaNoWriMo and kind of realized that, I can write 1,500 words a day if I just kind of make the time for it. And it's so much about just making the time for it and not being too precious. If you want to make a deadline, you can't be like, I don't feel like writing today.
Yeah.
Because right now there's most days.
Yeah.
But I do it anyway because it sticks the middle finger to certain people. So I'm sure I'm on some banned book lists, and that's just fine by me.
All right. Well, Natania, thank you so much for being with me on this show.
My pleasure.
Been wanting you for a while. Tell us where to find you online.
Sure. So the majority of my brain dumping is on Blue Sky these days, and I'm just at Natania over there, which is pretty easy. I am on Instagram still, and I'm at Natania Barron there. I have pulled back from TikTok, but those are the two places that I usually am at. I have my website, nataniabarron.com, and I do have a Patreon at Natania Books, where I have a huge archive of fashion information. So if you join at this point, moving forward, you have access to the gazillions of articles about various dresses and things like that, as well as updates and things of that nature. But like you, I need to redo mine and redouble my efforts a little bit, because it's a whole thing. Yeah,
exactly. And you're also on World Building for Masochists.
Yes, with Marshall Ryan Maresca and Cass Morris. I joined a little over a year ago. I had been a guest, and they called me up and like, do you want to do this like every other week? And I was like, yes, please. This is amazing. So we have a cool Discord you can join as well. We do have a Patreon that we just started recently, and we are excited to be growing and changing. And we have I am, as I know you are as well, having a community behind you and with you is one of the coolest gifts ever. And when I became part of the World Building for Masochists family, I sort of ended up with this whole like new arm of people that are awesome. And it's in these times, it is quite wonderful to have that. So when I'm having a really rough day, I'll just be on the Discord talking to people instead of like in the socials.
Great.
Boundaries.
Exactly.
Thank you for being on the show, Natania. I apologize again for taking so long to get it posted, but them's the breaks. I'm going to take a little time off, but I don't know if that's going to reflect to you because I'll probably be recording by the time this goes live. So I don't know if there's going to be a break or not. There's probably the break now that you didn't see coming because I didn't warn you. And 20 years, and I still haven't figured out the time shift with podcasting. Anyway, you guys know how to get in touch with me, mightymer@gmail.com. I'm very Googleable. I'll do proper endnotes with the next episode. Support if you can, spread the word if you can't. I'll see you next time, and you should be writing. Thank you for listening to I Should Be Writing, the longest running writing podcast in existence. Theme music provided by John Anelio, art provided by Numbers Ninja, and podcast hosting provided by Libsyn. This episode is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 license. You can find all of my books and podcasts at merverse.com.
I should be writing. I should be working on my craft.
Did that record it all?